we're going to dive straight in to, as we normally do with these sessions, a kind of presentation from me and then an opportunity to discuss that in more detail with co-presenter Silas, and then have some discussion and conversation about some of the topics that have come up. And if you want to particularly ask questions about other aspects that have come up in previous sessions, particularly relating to grazing, because I know that was quite a lot of chat we had last week and we ran right up to time. So if there are other questions you have about other sessions, then you're more than welcome to ask those. Right, I'm just going to share my screen. And I also just need to make sure, because I've got a video in this session, that I can share the video as well. So are you able to see that? I can't see you, Lou. If you could unmute and just tell me whether you can see that, that'd be great.
Yeah, we can see that.
Amazing. Thank you very much. So last two times ago that I delivered this, I asked some of the farmers to send me some pictures of, we were in a very wet time of year. It had been really, really wet, and I asked some of the farmers on the sessions to send me some of the poaching on their farms. So they were very generous and sent me these pictures, and they were talking about kind of, you know, the challenges that they've experienced. And the first two were from daily moves where it absolutely poured overnight, and then that evening they'd kind of gone, oh, shall I move them? Oh no, I'll wait till the morning, and then went out in the morning. That's what they found. And then the picture on the right is the sort of poaching that you can get in front of water troughs and in fixed grazing areas. And you can see it's quite claggy red, looks like kind of a Shropshire, Herefordshire type mud on that right hand side. But I think what's important to reflect on here is the difference between the first two pictures, where there is still some green, and particularly that first one on the left hand side, you know, a bit of rain and that will kind of wash off a bit and you'll get a decent amount of grass coming through and green showing again, and there's plenty of matter there, leaf matter, that is able to integrate with the soil. That picture on the right hand side in front of the trough, those really heavy compaction areas, this is the sort of the ground that, you know, really struggles to recover. And you come back here in the summer and it's still kind of the same color but dry and hard. So, you know, when we talk about poaching and then the resulting compaction, that these things aren't always the same. You know, the level of poaching, the level of interaction that the animal has with the soil, the repeated nature of that impact is what really does make the difference. And so that kind of quicker impact and the longer term impact that you'd see on the right hand side are going to leave very different outcomes. But yeah, let's move on. I just wanted to give you some examples. Oh, and this was one of our paddocks last winter. So again, very small number of cattle. It was just our bull group actually, and this was after I'd taken the fence down to move them on. It's a wetland restoration area, so it's going to be wet anyway. And I think this was just 4 bulls that overnight had decided to stand in that corner and had made a bit of a mess. But, you know, you go back there now and you can't see it at all. So it really does. It's just kind of, I guess, to show that these things happen. But what we need to do is think about how we deal with that situation. So this session is very much about initially how to avoid poaching and compaction, how to identify it and how to address it. So what happens when it does happen? And that right hand side picture really is just a reminder that if we're going to be out wintering our livestock, then we probably don't want to be putting them onto anything much less than that really. If we're going to be keeping animals out during the worst weather periods, we want to make sure there's plenty of biomass below their feet to hold them up. And, you know, we really can all get it wrong at times, as I've already said. We definitely have farms. If you're involved in the mob grazing WhatsApp group, you'll know that when we have wet weather, there's always a little flurry of photos of oh shit moments from the night before when people have not gone out and moved animals and it's got really wet and really soggy and really muddy. But, you know, it's about how we deal with that as a decision-making framework. You know, what do we do? What's the so what of that result? And like I've said before, you know, you've seen this image before. Animal impact is more than just grazing. So we have that grazing element, but there's the saliva, the dung and urine, the moving of microbes, the transporting of seed, the rubbing and breaking of branches in silvopastoral settings, and then the trampling. And it's that presence of animal feet on the ground that we can use as a tool for good, but we can also, it can also cause damage if we don't think about that impact. And the way that all of these things interact with each other, particularly the amount of grazing, leaving shorter covers, and then prolonged trampling in wet weather. Something that I personally feel quite strongly about, and I know Silas maybe doesn't agree, is I know Silas is a bit of a fiend on a quad bike and using that to move animals about. Personally, I cannot abide any driving of any sort over any fields. Even like the lightest vehicles, you can see if tall grass grazing and you don't really use wheeled vehicles much, just moving I don't know, like a Polaris or something across the field. If you're not using those vehicles often, you really can see the difference. You can see those tracks, they're still there months and months later. And I just think it's something that is really under considered. And I remember being on a farm in the south of Scotland at a Pasture for Life event a couple of years ago. And it was a sheep field, and we were all standing in this field looking at the ground, and the farmer was talking about how frustrated he was that he couldn't address the compaction, and he was thinking about his grazing management, and he was going on and on and on about the sheep and the stocking density of the paddocks and how often he was moving them and the frequency. And I looked down, and all around me I could just see tire tracks, and I was like, how much are you driving over this field? And he was like, oh, we're driving over here every day because, we're moving stuff about, we're doing this and we're doing that. And I was saying, well, I know that we've got low pressure tires, but soil wasn't designed to hold up vehicles. Soil was not designed to hold up multiple tons on it. So even though we might have low pressure tires, it's still a weight that has to exist on the soil, on a living system. And I'm pretty sure that if one of those vehicles ran you over, you'd probably be struggling. So I think, sometimes we underestimate the impact that vehicles can have, even if it's just quad bikes that are having across fields, and trying to reduce the amount that we're doing that as much as possible can be a real benefit. Just a reminder again of, these are images we've seen before, looking at our normal soil, our healthy soil compared to our compacted soil. And the difference really is all about air. We talked in the very first session about it not being water that was the most important aspect in terms of giving life in our soils, but it really is air. It's allowing air to get into our soils to make sure that they're not operating anaerobically, so that all of the organisms in that soil can function and can deliver the health benefits that we need. And the more diversity we have above ground, where we're going to get all those different roots, and we're then going to have that helping to create that structure below soil. And we also know that complexity of diversity of plants is going to have an impact on our genetic profile of our microorganisms. We've talked about that in a previous session. That complexity means that we've got greater resilience. So all of these things are synergistic. They all feed into each other. And in order for those plants, those microorganisms, to deliver that resilience in our system, they have to be able to breathe. So compaction isn't necessarily, I think we often think about compaction as this, what happens near or around the surface of the soil and the impact it has on plants. But actually it has such an impact on our soil's ability to function, not even just to be healthy, but just to get through the day. Because if we think about reducing airflow, as much as you can see here on this chart, the indicative loss of airflow suddenly means that we're suffocating our organisms. So making sure that we're creating that rest, we're creating that opportunity for much more air to get into our soils, means that we're going to have much greater opportunity to grow more grass, be more profitable, increase our resilience and our sustainability. A reminder again about diving into our soil micropores, and that thing about connected porosity. The greater the connected porosity, the greater that complexity in the DNA of our microorganisms, enabling them to deliver that resilience for us. And what we want is this porous features in our soil, which create the pockets and the spaces for carbon to fix into the soil, which then act as building blocks for the life below ground, and again allows that air and that water, when we do get those rain events, to infiltrate, and of course creating ways for our underground friends like earthworms, beetles, other larvae, etc., to move around. If we're asking our earthworms, etc., to put all their energy just into trying to get through rock concrete soil, they're not able to put their energy into doing all the things that we need them to do to keep our soils healthy. We're putting stress on those organisms, and we're expecting them to perform under survival mode, where actually what we need them to do is be in thrive mode, which means that they can deliver all of the additional ecosystem service benefits that we need them to keep our pastures healthy, And obviously healthy pastures, growing good grass, creating a better profit margin, more output per hectare. Again, just that reminder that all of this stuff is combined, it's all relevant together, trying to kind of separate ideas out around soil structure or connectivity or cycling. These things are so entwined, it's difficult to pull them apart and look at them separately and have such interdependencies in their relationships. So in our healthy soils, we have that good soil structure with a mix of macro and micro aggregates. We want to see that aggregation, good pore structure and connectivity. And that leads into the effective root penetration into the different layers of the soil, nice long roots able to access different parts of the soil profile, enabling an extensive mycorrhizal network, enabling efficient water infiltration and high oxygen permeability. So we are supporting those microorganisms to be able to breathe. We often think about plants being, drawing down carbon dioxide, and we often forget about all the oxygen that's actually required in the soil to enable all of this functioning to happen. If we focus too much on carbon, sometimes we forget the other very important critical players in this cycle. So part of all of that good structure with that strong connectivity leading to that cycling of nutrients, that cycling of energy from the sun into the roots, into the soil, enabling us to grow more grass, and the cycling also of those nutrients so that we can have plants that are healthy and can access all of the nutrients that they need to. Efficient metabolic activity, soil bacteria breaking down methane to carbon dioxide as methanotropes, effective nitrogen cycling with low nutrient leaching, so that all of the nutrients that are deposited on our soils from our livestock are maintained in a closed system and we're not losing them into the nearest waterways. And you can see here that if we have that degraded soil and that top part has dispersed particles and fewer macro aggregates, and it's kind of all squished together and has a disconnected pore structure, that actually the roots are not able to get down as far. We're just not optimizing the full profile of the soil. And I think I talked before, I mentioned about being in a field in a friend's farm and doing a bit of sort of informal consultancy for them. And they took me to a part of the farm that lay wet. So a bit like that middle bottom picture, you can kind of see the sort of water just sitting on the top of the soil there. And they took me to part of the farm and said, oh, this is always really lies wet. It must be really boggy here. We think maybe it's a spring from below. And I dug a hole and below the puddle, the soil was bone dry. And it really kind of shocked them because they thought we were going to dig into essentially a bog. But actually what was happening was there was so much compaction that a puddle had formed, but below it, there was no water getting in at all. So it's really important that we kind of dig holes and we think about what's going on below just what we can see on the top. And we challenge our assumptions sometimes about whether this is wet ground or whether it's compacted ground that water can't get into. And so if we create these structures and the potential for connectivity and cycling, we're going to make sure that we have much more healthy pastures, healthier animals, as I said, more profitable systems. And REST really is this incredibly powerful tool. And this came from a Teagasc, so the Knowledge Exchange and Research Agency in Ireland. And they're kind of on these very intensive 21-day dairy rotations with quite a lot of nitrogen going into the system. But you can even see there that, just 7 days of rest in these even more intensive systems than some of us might be running or looking to run. Just having that space to allow those plants to recover makes a massive difference. Post-grazing damage on a wet day, overnight, and then recovery of the sward 7 days later, you can see that it's still pocketed and marked, but the amount of grass that's able to come through and kind of continue its photosynthetic capacity is amazing. And it really just is that power of rest can make all of the difference. This is the same field in each of these two photos. So this was from one of the mentors from the Southeast program, and he shared these photos with me about a year and a half ago. And he wanted to show a picture. So the right-hand picture was, again, cattle overnight on a wet, horrible, cold night. The left-hand side was just a few months later. And you really can see like the different, you wouldn't have known on that left-hand picture. So this is kind of turned and looking the other way, so it's looking back up the field, that any of that would have been poached in that way. I mean, you just can't tell the difference at all. You can't see that the damage, if you like, and that's because it was very much surface damage. And this is the kind of difference between what we might call a massage and and consistent poaching. Because those animals were moved straight off there, they were put somewhere else, they could move on, allow that ground to rest. A bit of rain would have washed most of that mud off that's sitting on the top, and then the plants would have been able to get back to photosynthesizing. If we just leave animals there and we let them continue to stay in that place, the long-term damage to the soil structure, the soil profile, the roots is going to be extreme. And that long-term damage is something that we really, really want to avoid. So if you're creating a mess on the farm, you just need to get those animals moved off and give that space and time to rest. I've got a video here from Rob Havard, who some of you may know. I think maybe there's been some visits that some of you might have gone on. And this visit, this was I was maybe 3 or 4 years old now. He looks a lot younger in that video. So I'm just going to let that play. And yeah, you'll be able to see some of Rob's reflections on, again, a bit of a wet, boggy area that came about after leaving animals on in wet weather.
As you can see, we've just moved the mob into the next group, into the next patch, sorry. And you can see the water through the drag trough in here. This is where we've been grazing. I just thought I'd show you some of where we've been. So this is some we've grazed just recently. You can see the water there in the tractor marks to show how close the surface is. And you can see the lake in the distance, and that actually was held artificially high, which didn't help us for a bit. It gives you an idea how close the water is to the surface and what we're grazing. Just show you over here, we've got an area left and right here. So left we had the water trough, and right we've had it possibly for a couple more days because we fed some bales. And it just shows you the damage from just around the water trough, but the whole patch we grazed is looking good. You know, I think this is an area that was all dug up about 5 years ago for a ground source heap loop over about 6-7 acres. And it's the only place on this farm where we've got docks where they dug it up and they put the subsoil on the top and the topsoil next to the pipe loops. But just if we're looking here, you can see there's actually quite a lot of grass material here. So actually areas like that will come back fine. And just if you're worried about what you're looking at, I think there's a couple of tests. Is, have you got ground cover? So obviously just where the trough was, there's no ground cover. And then if you look here down at the down where you've got the pooled water, and bear in mind just here is where I poured the water trough out. But if you've got like floating soil life, I'll quite often in patches like this see some worms floating, and if you've got that over a large area and you killed off your soil life, that's obviously too much, but that's a good measure in the wet to see if you know how you're doing. So those two things really. Have you got ground cover still? And the other question mark is, have you killed off the soil life? Can you see that? Okay, as you can see, the sun's just come up. Lovely day for it, and the Lord has blessed us with some dry weather in the next couple of weeks, it looks like. So feeling blessed today. Hope you have a happy new year and you had a great Christmas, folks, and see you soon.
So you can see from what Rob was saying there that, you know, there are quick ways that you can do that assessment, that rapid assessment of what's happened on your field. If you've got floating worms, not a good look. And that might be something that you think, okay, I want to avoid doing that in future. But these things are inevitable. If we're going to start extending our grazing season, keeping animals out for longer, we're going to have to deal with some of the more challenging weather. And the ways that we can address that is having those really nice high covers, rather than having short covers that we're going on to, and also just keeping those animals moving and learning from our mistakes, because we will make them, and we just have to accept that. One of the great things about this sort of grazing is that you come back there in the spring, and that patch, if that is still really like horrible and hasn't recovered and is really struggling, you just fence it off. That's the amazing thing about electric fence or no fence collars. You can just put a line around the bit that needs a bit of extra rest, and it can have its extra rest. And I think being a little bit adaptive and thinking about that, and you know, it'd be good to kind of hear Silas's thoughts on that as we come into the chat in a moment. So again, just a reminder on the right hand side, if we keep those tall covers, if we don't hit those plants too hard and keep regrazing them, we can keep those nice long roots, we can keep some cover above, that will help us to manage and mitigate against some of the challenge we might expect if we're trying to graze animals in that wet weather. Again, a reminder, we saw this last week, so I won't labour too long on this, but really thinking about that adaptive grazing, that rest, to keep roots in the ground, to keep biomass above ground, to hold animals up and to keep them moving, so that rest is what we manage for rather than impact. And quite often what we see where we've got compaction, or we have got significant poaching that has then led to compaction, particularly around troughs. We will see potentially a prevalence of these plants. So on the left-hand side and in the plant in the middle, both quite similar roots, that the left-hand side is a dock, and the plant in the middle is a thistle, and then the plant on the right is a chicory. And so these plants really do help us to move towards succession, and healing very much is a natural process. And sometimes I think we panic too much about these plants and think about how we can get rid of them, but actually what they're often doing for us is fixing and, you know, and supporting the soil to become healthier, and they're addressing the issues of air not getting into the soil. And the same for rushes as well. Just to show that this is an area 24 hours before and after, and, you know, panicking about docks. And interestingly, this part of the field where these docks are, both on the left-hand side of the picture and immediately next to the fence, this is an area that's quite sheltered on a farm that we used to manage a few years ago. And it was quite a sheltered area. And when this was set stocked before we grazed it, animals would just hang out down at the bottom of this slope, because they could get out of the wind and they could get out of the rain. And so that inevitably meant that we got lots of docks coming through as a result of the animals loafing historically, and then that soil getting compacted. And we just don't worry about it too much, because by changing the stocking density in this paddock, we reduce the animals' selective grazing capacity. So we create more competition by tightening them up a little bit. And actually what we find is that when we reduce the amount of mineral that we might be giving our cattle, that they selectively graze docks anyway, because they're really high in magnesium. So it's not something to be too worried about. And if they are there, I think, you know, recognizing that they're doing a job, and that, you know, if you get really stressed about them, by all means, you could go and top them later in the year. But actually, they are the only home of the green dock beetle, which is a really important food source for birds and small mammals, and their seeds are a really important food source for birds in the winter. So there is a role that these plants play, even if we'd get quite stressed about them, and somebody at some point created a ridiculous law that said they were injurious. Cool, so that's my presentation. Let's just stop sharing. And gonna have a chat with Silas. So Silas, challenges around poaching and compaction. Can you talk a little bit about when you were at FAI, only because Lou mentioned it earlier, in particular around the kind of floodplain, challenges around grazing on wet ground, and issues that you had, and whether that was something that you kind of had to learn to deal with, or you were able to mitigate using your management techniques?
Sure. So for those that don't know, FAI is about 1,500 acres on the edge of Oxford, kind of medium heavy clay soils. About 60% of the farm was on a floodplain. The rest of the farm still got very wet in the winter. I guess before I went there, it was always organic, but it was always conventionally run in the organic sense. It was lots of set stocking. It would always be a drought and cracked in the summer, and too wet, waterlogged, puggy in the winter. So kind of those classic clay soils and that story that goes with them. But what we saw was, with the change in grazing management quite quickly, you know, as Nikki said, just building that biomass above ground, those different structures of the biomass as well, allowing that thatchy layer to come through, you know, decreasing the amount of bare ground in between plants, because, you know, we were letting things seed. We're using animal impact to trample that in to, like, improve the quality and density of the pasture, but also the rest periods were helping move that succession up as the soil structure and the air and the water and all that stuff below improved with the management too. So really the key with compaction for me is it's a couple of things. There's the biomass above ground, and also the root biomass below ground, because that puts a lot of structure into your soil as well. That gives you structure into that. If you just had soil and air, you know, you can squish that out quite well, as well as that cushion above ground in the plant biomass and how dense and tall that is, but also how structured is that with the root mass below. Also, why is the compaction there in the first place? So, you know, no part of your farm is going to be perfect. You know, yeah, I'll have a quad bike, particularly when you're at kind of a big scale like that. But you know, I would drive on the same places on purpose, so that you only had very minimal impact, and You know, that's not going to make or break my system because there's half a dozen tracks that I consistently use across the farm. But then you're always driving over the, you know, you would drive over the pasture that's not been grazed behind the cows. So you're driving on that cushion and that just bounces back up, right? Instead of driving on what's been grazed quite tight in that winter graze. So then you're just basically driving straight onto bare ground. But really it comes down to soil structure, right? And soil structure is fed by is predominantly produced by our biology. And you know, there's kind of the right types of bacteria and the right types of fungi. And they need that air and they need that water, which is kind of chicken and egg. So to stimulate our soil biology, yes, we need those plants, we need those deep root systems. What we need is effective photosynthesis. So just because we have green plants, and we might have some deep roots, are they actually photosynthesizing effectively? And that could be a mineral issue on your farm. A lot of high mag soils, we can see a big antagonistic effect with potassium, and the same with potassium and mag. So if you have an excess in one, you often get a massive reduction in the other. Potassium is really key in photosynthesis in that process. So is boron and manganese. So you might have plants that you think are feeding your biology and you think they're cycling carbon through that energy flow, but actually maybe that's quite limited because there's a mineral thing that might need to be addressed. If you've got a good set of chemistry, actually through the grazing management, you can see changes quite quickly, which is what we saw at Oxford. So we really built that kind of that microbial biomass in our soil so that even in those very, very wet winters on that heavy clay, on those cells that got hit quite hard in very wet times, literally within weeks, they bounced back and were green. And a lot of that kind of pugging was getting leveled out. So yeah, I think it's worth getting a snapshot of where you think you are on all these different moving parts of your system, and then get curious and like dig holes and start questioning why you're seeing things that you're seeing, or why things didn't happen that you expected, or why when you gave it extra rest, it didn't look like your friend that gave it extra rest in another part of the country.
Thanks, Silas. We've got a question. So yeah, let's dive into the questions a bit and then we can pick up a bit more about your experiences. So James has asked, were you measuring your soil microbial populations to know what was going on at FAI?
You can do a lot. There's more labs now that are offering that service. At FAI specifically, it was mainly more on the macro microbes like your earthworms and those kind of critters. Generally, there's other indicators, right? If you're seeing more aggregation and structure and cakey structure, and your soil is darker than it was at baselining year, then you know that biology is there to create the aggregation. Because without that structure, that would be indicating that there's not really the biology that's doing the work if the management should be facilitating the biology. But yeah, there's some Nick Padwick at, can't remember his company now, Wild Ken Hill Farm, he's done the Elaine Ingham stuff, so you can send him soil samples. You can get quite cool insights from him. It's all done on microscope, and a couple of other labs. But obviously timing of that, if you were going to do that, and I would generally do that with a client, is look at the chemistry, plant analysis, and the biology, but just be really aware of the timing that you're taking those samples in the year and the weather, etc.
I think that's a really good point, and it is ultimately just a snapshot, and so that longer term monitoring I think is really important. And I definitely would recommend, depending on like if you've got the budget to do a lot of that testing, then absolutely crack on. But I think one of the first things to do is to start taking more observation of what, like you were saying there, Silas, about, looking at the soil, looking at the aggregation, looking at what's going on, just doing that visual assessment. So you're getting a good handle of what it should look like. Because I think sometimes we can spend a huge amount of money on testing and sampling, and you get the results back. And unless you're then willing as well to spend the money on a consultant to help you interpret that and then put a management plan in place, then it can just be a lot of money spent on getting some results. So would definitely recommend, if that's something that, if you've been maybe changing your grazing management for a bit and you don't feel like you're seeing changes or things aren't going the direction you thought they might, then absolutely do some samples. But yeah, think about the additional cost it's probably going to take to get a little bit of help and support to understand what that means. There's an example, like on the land that we've been managing for the last 3 years, there is a field that just seems sick. Like the field just seems like it's not well. You know, the soil isn't that bad, and the earthworm numbers are really good, and the aggregation's improving, but just the plant communities are not reflecting what we're seeing elsewhere on the estate. It just doesn't seem, you know, there's just a feel about it, and maybe the smell of the soil is a bit acrid. It's just not, and I think, you know, that giving it a bit of time and spending a few years changing the management, and we're still not seeing the changes there, but we're seeing them elsewhere. Now's the time to start doing some sampling and understanding what's going on, because it's clear that what's happening in that field is very different from the responses we're seeing elsewhere. So I think, yeah, being quite targeted about testing can also be helpful if budget is restricted.
I think, you know, with budget, you know, for me, it's always about observing on a daily basis, or like, so there's so many things you can do that you don't need to pay for. You know, as you said, do your plants look healthy? Are they, you know, are they good kind of green, or have they got chlorosis and discoloring and, you know, intravenal kind of discoloration in the veins or in between the leaves or something like that, which can indicate what minerals might be deficient. You know, if we're digging holes, are those roots, you know, are they white or brown? Are they sticky or not sticky? You know, these are going to indicate whether we actually are getting effective photosynthesis, whether those roots are really doing their job. Is that soil structure starting to get aggregated even at a very shallow layer? Does that smell nice and earthy at the very top of the soil? Maybe it doesn't smell of anything further down. And when we dig in 6 months' time, maybe if you did that in the spring, did it in the autumn, has it changed? Has it grown? And you don't need to pay anyone to do that, but it's, as you say, it's kind of gut feeling, like, oh yeah, it doesn't look right. The colors aren't there, the smells aren't there, or something.
James, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah. This is a question I've asked Silas before directly, but it might be useful to share it on this group and get the answer. We have reseeded some rather tired, I call it it's an old permanent ley, that when I looked at it, I think it was before, it was last, not this, 2023 autumn. It was very sparse, had a lot of, the previous spring it had a lot of moss growing in it between. All of the plants are pretty moribund. And we then, with the advice of a wildflower and native species advisor, we actually partially cultivate the tree. So actually did quite intentional damage to it with discs, because that's what they recommend, or he recommended, to get enough space for well, basically to weaken what was left of the ryegrass and other things, and to create space for some of these other grasses. But once you've done that and you still haven't perhaps got the diversity you want, the question I have is, do you obviously bale grazing, you can keep on adding more seed from external sources, but if you're trying to create the opportunities for perhaps less vigorous plants to establish, whether you're better off hitting it a bit harder with your grazing, which opens it up a bit and gives other, you know, new seed a chance to grow, or whether it would just as likely grow in a healthy sward. Because when you've got a big, you know, a thick sward with little open ground cover, there's not much space for new things to get going. And if you're looking to sort of enhance your species mix, seems to be a bit of there's two types of advice. One is, you know, hammer it with a cultivator or sheep or whatever to give space for things to grow, or just keep bale grazing it and it will sort itself out over time. So don't know if you all have the same opinion or different ones, but it seems to be still a bit unclear to me.
Do you want to go first, Silas? If you've already answered this question before, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then I'll maybe chip in.
It depends where you're at, right? You know, if you've got a degraded, compacted, bacterially dominated soil with a poor mineral cycle and a lack of other biology, then to expect that just to add some seed to it, we're going to see a very diverse, resilient wildflower meadow. What we want to see above ground isn't being aligned with what's actually there below ground. So this is essentially what succession is. The plants we see coming through, whether we put them there intentionally or not, are the plants that are suited to be in the soil conditions below. So if we go in and have to cultivate to fix bad compaction, maybe that isn't a mechanical intervention that we need to do to be able to get the ball rolling in the right direction. And we could put a diverse seed mix there, but the chances are we're not going to see all of those seeds come through. And if we do, they might not be persistent. So what we often see is annual plants do well, which is why often in new herbal ley, it looks quite flowery with the annuals, or we get annual weeds. Essentially arable farming, right? We cultivate, reduce, knock back soil structure, which proliferates lower successional species of annuals, so we put a wheat annual grass in. So it's essentially what you're going to do once that's there. You know, it's really down to the management. It might take you 4 or 5 years to get that diverse flower meadow, but it's how are you managing that grazing in the meantime? Are we actually creating the conditions and using the plants that are there, whatever those plants are, to move the soil structure, to feed that biology, to start building that aggregation? Because once you get more air and more water, that facilitates the biology to move, and the biology facilitates our mineral cycle. And we use our grazing management to create the right germination triggers and use the right rest periods at the right time of the year for the right reasons. That's when we start to see the more interesting flowers come through, which is what we saw at FAI. We turned low diversity fields full of moss into pyramid orchids and everything else just within a couple of winters. So, but that farm was different to your farm. So the right way to do it and the time frame that might take is going to be different. But it's
the question, I guess, is what is right? We say do it at the right time, the right way, for the right reason. My question is, what is the right way? And where do you get the advice? When you look at it, how do you know what the right time is? You know, we ended having reseeded it last autumn, 23. It's better. The grass generally is a better sward, but we didn't have the diversity of what we expected in terms of all the things that were planted. Some things came, but not all by any means. You know, they often advise put yellow rattle in to reduce the vigor of the grasses so that some of the wildflowers come through. There was a fair bit of yellow rattle, but all the same, you know, quite a lot of things aren't there yet. And people say, well, just wait, it'll come, and you know, they don't all germinate in one go. You might get them next year. But you know, then the question is, do you go really easy on it? We've actually just bale grazed it over in November. And you know, moving on quite fast. It wasn't a massive impact, but I don't know if that's right or wrong. Whether we, you know, what is the right intervention to push it in the right, you know, in a positive direction?
You've got to make little trials, right? You know, you can do in the same season. We weren't sure what to do, so we did this in a proportion of the field. We gave it extra rest in another. We bale grazed that half. We didn't bale graze this half. Then you start creating your own feedback loops, and then you start building your own evidence base of the decisions you made and which one moved in the direction that you wanted to go. So, you know, it's so people always kind of hope you can give them like the magic answer, but it's kind of like just try and be curious and ask yourselves these questions, and what can you do to try and do your own little investigation and see what tools there might be or what ways there might be out there by asking people. I think as well, you know, if you're going to do cultivation, then what else are we doing aside from just management that might move things along a little bit quicker? So, you know, if we're going to go and knock the house down about soil biology, why don't we put some biostimulants and some carbon-based cheap input down there with some water, like, you know, humic acid and some molasses or something like that. So we're putting a food source there. So whatever biology is there, we're giving it a first aid pack once we've smashed it with a mechanical whatever, so it wakes it up and helps move things in the right direction. Compost, things like that, depending on what your soil chemistry might be doing, it might not be the right decision, but depending on what your soil chemistry is up to and what that looks like, maybe an input like that is the right decision.
Yeah, that aligns with the discussion we had the other week where I said if someone came and turned your house upside down and expected you to get about your day, it'd be really difficult. But if that happened, but then they gave you a cake, you'd kind of feel like you were more able to like get on with your day, you know, if you're being fed at the same time. And I think it's really tricky, isn't it, James? Because not only have our fields and our soils have been kind of treated in a particular way for decades now, we've also all got quite used to kind of to having not prescriptions but advice that you do the thing and then in a year, you know, in that growing season, because we work on kind of annual timescales, that this thing will happen. And I have lots of challenging conversations, friendly but challenging conversations with colleagues working for meadow restoration organizations or projects who are absolutely hammering the ground. And I'm kind of standing there watching, you know, cultivators going up and down and stuff being disked, and, you know, the ground getting absolutely hammered. And then, you know, they're kind of throwing tons of diverse seed at it and stepping back and going, isn't that wonderful? And I'm thinking, well, is that soil functioning? And actually, if we might have those plants there, but are they going to persist? So have we got a resilient sward that can help us to deliver all the things that we need to enable a sustainable, financially resilient farm system? Or actually, has this cost us an absolute fortune? And also, is it going to persist? We don't know, because it all depends on our grazing management. So the challenge that, you know, whenever Silas and I are doing any sort of talks or anyone asks us questions, the answer is always it depends. And it's becomes a bit of a joke that that's what all of us end up having to say, but it does depend. And it's really difficult as well, because it's giving, even if you're working, you know, someone could come and visit your farm. One of us could come and visit your farm and look at what you're doing and go, yeah, okay, well, it looks like you're on the right tracks. But unless you kind of got that repeat visit and you're engaging and you're having that conversation, it can be really difficult to kind of tailor advice and support and guidance. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I appreciate how frustrating it is when you ask people who you might think have some answers, and then we say annoying things like it depends, and it, you know, you could do this or you could do that or you could do the other. And I guess that's the joy for me of regenerative agriculture, agroecology, is that actually we all become experts in our own, even on a corner of the field, we can become an expert. And we have that excitement of being able to discover things as they change. The other thing to take into account with all of this is that we're living in a time of you know, more challenging and severe weather events. So we might do something and think that we're going to have a particular outcome, and then it absolutely pours with rain, and we get more rain in 24 hours than we'd normally get in a month, and suddenly everything that we thought was going to happen doesn't. So I think we have to learn to be easy on ourselves. And for me, it's about looking at, you know, yes, you might have, if you're engaged, let's say, in a BNG scheme and you've got to deliver a particular outcome, maybe the pressure's slightly different. But ultimately, if this is about you running a farm system and your output is predominantly animals, not natural capital, although natural capital goes alongside that, if your animals are healthy and doing well, then that's, you know, that's the primary thing to focus on. And we know that they're going to do well and be healthy. The more diverse the plants, but the more healthier the soil. But, you know, I think sometimes we can get too hung up on like a field or a plant assemblage, when actually long term, if the other business outcomes are being achieved, then we need to not be too hard on ourselves.
I think maybe a practical way is to think, right, do we need to do some work in how we're managing and what we do before we think about putting those seeds there? Because if we're operating in soils which are void of air and water, and it's playing with our base saturation, reducing pH, you know, like all this, the chemistry stuff that's going on underground, then those plants simply won't thrive. So is there a natural site that has the natural diversity on your soil type nearby that's been like that for hundreds of years or whatever, or it's successfully been regenerated and sustained it through management? What happened there? Like, what's going on in that soil? What does that soil look like? What's going on in the soil chemistry? Then what plants do we need to put there in the situation you're in that will function in the soil that you have right now, to start moving it to get the soil to that point before you start thinking about putting those seeds on? It's kind of that chicken and egg, right? It's like, right, maybe we need to work on the soil before trying to make the plants be there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just a very short sort of feedback from that. It's useful to think. I mean, we are trying to trial things, but every field is different in terms of its history, its soil, its current cover of you know, species mix, and even within fields, you've got lots of variations across the field. Different as you know, change soils going down slopes from the top of a ridge to the slope to the bottom. So yeah, there's a lot that is going on. I agree that there's some prep work to do on tired, compacted soils, and I think we're looking for ways that we can accelerate that cost effectively. And I think Silas is right. There's no, if you or both of you, if you spend money on the seed and the prep without actually sorting out the biology or the chemistry of the soil, you may not actually get the result. But you know, and having done it once, you can't do it. You can't go back and do it again. We really now got to use grazing and, you know, bale grazing as our main strategy. We won't go back and recultivate. So there are some fields we would rather not cultivate if we, it's not our preferred option. So we can try with bale grazing. But then the point, I guess the key tool you've got is how much you graze it, and whether grazing it harder to create more space is a good thing or not. That's, I guess, the variation that we can play with within the system. So we'll keep trying. We've tried various things, and we'll keep an eye on what happens.
I think just to add to that, James, you said a word that I always find really interesting, and just as a caveat, I am the most impatient person I know, maybe other than Silas. But you talked about, you used the word accelerate, and I think sometimes as humans we feel like we want to try and accelerate things because we recognize our own mortality, and so we only have so many years doing the thing we're doing. And as a grazier who is, I get access to land by the outcomes that we see on that land. So the quicker I can see those outcomes, the quicker I can say, hey, landowner, look at how good I'm, look at the good outcomes that I'm able to show you, and look at the value for money you're getting from this agreement. And so, but we have to, there's a need for responses that are quick, but at the same time nature is way more powerful than us, and she will operate at her time scale, and I think sometimes we have to remember that, and it's a hard thing, particularly for me as an individual, to remember, but because we want good outcomes, right? But sometimes it just takes time, and we have to remember that and not be hard on ourselves.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay. There was a question in the chat from Lou just saying, can you explain the white, brown, sticky, not sticky roots bit, Silas, please? So I think this is relating to root exudates and riser sheaths. So Silas, do you want to talk a bit about, I assume that's what you meant when you were talking about that?
Yeah, right. So, we've got roots in the ground that might be alive, we've got roots in the ground that might be dead. So if the root is like a twig and you snap it and it sounds like you're breaking a little twig you found on the floor, and it's like a real clear crack and it's brown inside, that's a dead root. It's not doing anything. It might still be attached to the plant, but there's no pathways or process or stuff going through that no exudates. If that root's bright white in the middle and it's probably gonna have a softer crack to it, that root's doing something. That plant is actually moving stuff through its physiology down into its roots into the ground. Again, if you pull that plant up and give it a good shake, are those roots holding on to soil, and is it sticking? Is the soil sticking on in like these tiny little smaller aggregates? Sometimes the big aggregates, right? You don't see it very often, particularly in the UK, but you see this kind of like dreadlock type roots, right? That's like the ultimate rhizosheath, like living root zone, where it's literally creating its own microcosm. It's affecting its own pH and its own mineral cycle and everything else. But you see that a lot. You can still see that in the UK context, but are the roots like washing clean, like when you take them out of the soil, or is like soil sticking to them, it's clinging on, right? It's creating these glues that we get with the bacteria and the fungi. When the fungi and the bacteria, when they essentially feeding off of those exudates through photosynthesis, they start to create those biotic glues, which is the basis of building these aggregates. So bacteria build the microaggregates, and then the fungi come in and start building these bigger aggregated soils, which is what we want to see, right? This shows that photosynthesis is actually happening. So how much roots we got, and are they actually working for us or not?
Awesome. Thanks, Silas. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question. Oops, let me just get rid of that. Am I? Oh, yeah, I am. Yeah, that acceleration. And I think I know what you're both going to say, but presumably a wider range of livestock is going to help you accelerate. I speak as a sheep farmer with sheep overgrazed pasture, which we're trying to change. And all that conversation about overseeding was very familiar because we were offered some seed by the National Trust of Species Rich Seed last winter, but because we hadn't graded down tight enough and didn't want to disc it, we didn't take it, and question what we do next year. Adding cattle into the mix would seem to be a pretty obvious way of accelerating things just by getting different hoof impact, let alone different grazing differently. Am I being really deluded to think that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to come out like I think sometimes there's something about diversity and complexity, but then offsetting that against what makes you as an individual happy.
Yeah.
So, you know, and that's the challenge, right? So yeah, it might be ideal to, I'm going to say yes, bring cattle in because I'm a cow person. So I'm going to be, yeah, absolutely. In fact, Ajax, sell all those sheep. Let's just go with cows. But, you know, I know that that's not realistic. And so I think sometimes, yeah, diversity is great, both in terms of plants, microbiology, you know, but also sometimes I think we can get carried away by thinking if we just, you know, put more livestock on top of more livestock, but it's a different kind. So I think, yeah, there's a balance to be had, right? And I think if getting cows is expensive, an unknown, different types of handling equipment, is that cost going to be offset the kind of benefits that you see? Maybe, maybe not. And I guess there's a financial decision to make, or get somebody like Silas as a grazier or me as a grazier to come and deliver that for you. That's the other option. Obviously I wouldn't because I'm in Scotland, but you know what I mean, you know, working with someone else in partnership that can help that happen. So there are options that can make it affordable. But I think, you know, there's also something about optimizing what you've got and kind of not in and again, you know, do you need to accelerate it? I don't know. Are there ways that you can test grazing it harder, or and when we say harder, what we really mean is, you know, really bunching those animals up. So we're not leaving them on there and forcing them to, because if you just leave animals somewhere longer and force them to eat, you're going to get a drop in the plane of nutrition. So the animal health is going to be affected, but also you're potentially creating a capping situation because you're just keeping animals in the same place for longer. So you've got to be able to bunch them up. And I think that doing that can be enough sometimes, that it can be enough of a, you know, a trigger that can start to see changes that you might not see if you're kind of moving once every 3 days, for example. So I don't, Silas, if you want to come in there, because maybe I'm wittering on a bit.
No, I think ultimately I always start with what can we do right now with what you have without going out and buying or doing much, and just to create a disruption. If you want to see a different outcome, do something different than what you've been doing, right? So, you know, as Nikki said, that could be, you know, actually we're going to move the sheep twice as quick, or we're going to have one group of sheep instead of 3 groups of sheep, or we're going to go around a different way around the farm. We're not always going to start in that field in the 1st of May and do the same rotation, right? So let's think of a long list of disruptions that are doing something different in different ways and different layers with what you have. And those disruptions, you're probably going to see some different outcomes. Now you can start trying to join the dots with the outcomes you'd like to see and what disruptions are most likely going to see that outcome. And then again, you've got other tools. Okay, right, maybe buying cows. Again, that's another disruption, right? You're adding something new to a system, and how you're going to manage it. So just like keep disrupting, and then, you know, you get used to, you have like 1 year or whatever, and you thought, oh, I've sussed this and I've cracked it. But you got to remember, everything we're managing in these systems is constantly evolving and changing. It's not just the weather and the seasons is different every year, but if our management's good, our soil is changing every year. Therefore, the succession in our pastures is changing every year. And our mineral cycle and the nutrition in our pastures and the energy flows through our different layers are changing. So, you know, and if we crack that 1 year and it worked really well, but then we just rinse and repeat that every year, we're probably going to hit a low ceiling, or we're going to hit something that curveballs us. So just keep tweaking with what you've got and observe and be curious and try and keep notes and log pictures of whatever things that you saw or did, a bit like what Rob did in that video, right? It was just taking a video of what happened. You could come back in 6 months and see how it recovered, and then do it differently a different year or something like that. So disruptions.
I think also, like, remembering that there are always going to be limitations. So the field that I mentioned that we are managing, that I feel is just sick, what I think it really needs is actually quite an intense disruption, an intervention in sort of early to mid-spring. But it's one of the only fields that we have in that area where we know we have nesting curlew. So I'm not going to go in there and start like absolutely putting in the level of animal pressure that I really want to and that I think it needs, if it's like the last stronghold on the estate for nesting curlew. So again, it's like, okay, am I going to be okay with the fact that I can't do what I want to and what I think it needs, looking at what we've done elsewhere, because actually those birds are really important and I want to try and maintain some habitat for them. And maybe there are other places that we can, you know, we can slowly shift that. So again, you know, it's just thinking about that holistic picture of what's going on across the farm and how we can deliver those interactions. I mean, this is the exciting stuff about these systems is that they are, you know, there's so much flux and change. And if you're someone who loves change and thrives in kind of chaos and change, then it's great. And if you're someone who loves a kind of the detail of the how to do things by kind of instruction and prescription, it can be really difficult. And then if you're somewhere in the middle, you know, it's exciting. Okay.
Being
Go
real,
on, sorry,
right?
Silas.
I was gonna say, like, being a bit real, like, not every bit of your farm is going to be and look exactly how you want it to look, because, you know, I'm lazy. I'm going to have fields around the sheds. They're going to get overgrazed sometimes. They're going to have nutrient loading because I want to have a TB test. I'm just going to stick cows there all week. And it's, you know, those fields aren't going to be my prized fields. Ironically, in Oxford, they were the ones right by the car park. So everyone could see them. And the bull paddocks too. But I was like, you know, it's like, you know, we can design systems that work best for us, but there's also an element of what can we actually action and deliver with the resources and the time and the labor and the skills, whilst accepting that actually maybe just everything isn't going to be perfect, and that's fine.
Yeah. And James makes a good point in the chat. He says it's a fact that when you mob graze a field, even in one field, you're grazing at different times under different weather conditions over, say, a month. But I guess that you know, that again depends on the size of your field, the size of your mob, how frequently you're moving. But essentially, yes, you know, everything is always changing. There's always flux, and that's kind of cool and exciting. And you're right, it could just be that one strip was grazed just right. If the results look good in that strip, might be that the weather and timing were better to be on it. Absolutely. I know, I find that stuff really exciting. George, I have a feeling that you had a question last week that I was like, wait till next week and we'll talk about it. And then I feel like maybe I haven't talked about it. I feel like I've done a really bad job here of being running this session and not remembering your question from the other week.
I can't remember it either, but I feel like it's been answered. So thank you.
No worries. I've got a feeling it might have been about like subsoiling or aerating, but maybe that wasn't you and that was someone else.
Yeah, well, I did ask about that, I think in the first week.
Okay.
But I guess it's sort of, yeah, like you Silas mentioned about kickstarting off that process. And then, yeah, he's made the point of Nikki, of deserving the right to use the mechanical intervention. But something we've had is some fairly compacted, some fields that are quite wet and rushy, and they're always quite compacted. And we had some cricket bat willow being harvested, and they came in sort of September and made a right mess. So there were some really deep ruts. I was just wondering what your recommendations would be, because obviously we don't really want to roll it if it's already compacted. But yeah, there's just sort of deep ruts with pools of water in them. So I was wondering what your thoughts would be.
Yeah, I have a similar challenge where the SSCN electricity guys came in, drove all over the fields, left massive ruts everywhere, and yeah, I ended up actually finding a newborn calf upside down in one of them, because I didn't realise, yeah, they'd managed to get up under the electric fence and head into a rut. So totally recognise the challenge of that, and I think that sometimes, yeah, I mean, there was an interesting conversation that was very similar to this actually on one of the mob grazing chats, and someone was like, oh God, what do I do? You know, do I bale graze on it? Do I do this? Do I do that? And someone else was like, just harrow it, just sort it out in one hit, because actually it's already had that disruption, and just going in and trying to like just sort it out and just put a bit of effort into maybe, you know, creating more disruption, but just doing that once, and then, you know, maybe take the opportunity to put some interesting seed on it or something. And actually, sorry, I'm just going to slightly divert and say that something I didn't mention, but I kept thinking as I was presenting, or I need to remember to talk about this, is that if you do get those patches around water troughs or around areas that get really messy after, you know, a wet night, having like a bag of interesting seed in the shed, like just a small couple of kilos that you can take out a small amount and chuck into those areas, is a really good way to try and add diversity. So Heather Close, who's a certified Pasture for Life farmer who's in southwest Scotland, in Ayrshire, that's something she does, and she's got funding actually from her local Nature Networks fund to buy this like really expensive, lovely native grown seed from Scotia Seeds. And she's able then, when she has wet nights in the winter, she'll actually sometimes leave the cattle on a bit longer than she maybe would otherwise, so that she's got somewhere that she can immediately throw some of the seed into. So I think, yeah, kind of using these as opportunities to create that disruption and add some different seed can definitely help. And if you've got horrible big ruts, maybe just harrow it and, yeah, get it sorted. I don't know, Silas, if you would agree, but
Generally, the more the more man-made degradation that's happened or damage means the more likely you need a man-made tool to try and fix it, or not fix it, but at least kind of reset and get it something. Then do what can we do once we make it, use a man-made tool like machines or cultivators or whatever, then what do we do after? So yeah, I would do that. Again, you can't make everything perfect, right? So what do we want to do with it once we've done when something like that's happened?
There's a question from James about humic acid recommendations and how many regen graziers actually apply it. We don't have the kit, so we'd have to invest. Do you have any experience of what kit works and is affordable? I would really recommend connecting with a guy called Matt Griffin, who farms up in Peebles in the Borders in Scotland, Pasture for Life member, not certified. He's also involved in the NFFN, Nature Friendly Farming Network. He's been doing loads of trials on humic acid and has made some fancy bits of kit that go on the back of, and they're using various IBCs and little spraying setups and stuff that is off the back of a quad. So he'd probably be worth just connecting with and having a chat with. And I think that, to be honest, there's lots of people that don't. And if you talk to people like Stu Johnson, you know, I think there's often a process, and Silas, you might really disagree with this because the work that you've been doing with Nicole Masters, but I think sometimes we go through a process of like, yeah, James, I'll send you his contact details. We go through a process of like getting really deep and excited about all these different things that we can do and fancy bits of kit or applications we can make, and then ultimately what most of us, I would hazard a guess saying most of us find, is actually just managing your grazing better means that you can get some really good outcomes. So if you're the sort of person that likes making lotions and potions and playing around with that, crack on, because you know, adding something isn't probably going to be harmful and it's not going to be a problem. And if that's how you want to spend your time, money, resources, then great. But I do think that ultimately most people kind of get to a point where they go, well, actually, if I just sort my grazing out, particularly if it's permanent pasture, that if I just get my grazing better, I'm probably going to have some good outcomes. But yeah, Silas, you might not agree with that.
Well, I'm the laziest farmer out there. I'm impatient, but like, I think about doing a workshop or writing a book, and I'm going to swear, called The Power of Doing Fuck All. And like, that's what I do. I literally just put a system in that's really quick and easy, and I let the cows and nature do all the hard work. And I just try and have active observations about how I might just use disruptions to tweak it to get the outcomes I want. You know, the humic acid stuff, if you're like really intent on cultivating X amount of space because you really want to get these wildflower meadows, then maybe it's worth the hassle of mounting a little sprayer unit on the, you know, back of an aerator or your power harrow or whatever, and you just, you know, on an aerator you just put like hoses down each blade and calibrate it so that as you're going through with the aerator, you're just dripping it down into the soil. It's that, you know, it can be that simple. Again, you know, if you're 5,000 hectares or acres of arable farming and you're doing a lot of cultivation all the time, or you're no-till and you just do very light cultivations or something very occasionally, or whatever it might be your context, then it might be worth investing in a bit of kit that you're going to use a lot because you're going to do it. So you may as well, when you do it, put something down there. So again, context, right? If you've got 2 acres that you're just going to plow it up once and that's it, then just use management. But if you really, really, really want to kickstart something like your soil biology and you know you're going to plow it or cultivate or whatever, then that's a tool you could look at. But it doesn't have to be expensive, right? It can literally just be getting an old IBC, strapping it onto the back of a whatever, and as you do your thing, you just dribble it down with some water and some molasses or whatever else.
Thanks, Silas. And James, yeah, I've got your email address now, so thank you for sharing that. No need to do the connecting up, Lou. And again, another reference to Nick Padwick. He's got some right old fancy bits of kit that he's been doing stuff with that. So he's over in Norfolk. Really, most mind-blowing windrows of compost I've ever seen, but a significant lack of livestock in the system. So yeah, I mean, I think, and that has changed slightly, but really interesting work that they've been doing over there around compost extracts, wormery, a massive wormery on the go, and all sorts of exciting things. There's people out there. If that's your bag, then there are people out there doing some cool stuff. And as I said, Matt up in Scotland, and actually Jamie Jack, who is Pasture for Life member of staff, he's our Scotland regional manager. He's done the Elaine Ingham course. Again, another good person that I can put you in touch. So James, I'll connect you with Matt, with Jamie as well as Matt, both of them. really experienced in this and could offer some interesting insights. And lots of sheep experience as well. Is it, James, it's sheep you've got, is that right? Or is it
I
cattle?
got rid of the sheep. Cows.
That's the one.
We have other people's sheep if we need them, but we haven't got our own flock anymore.
Okay, cool. I was going to say otherwise that, yeah, good people to chat to more generally about sheep as well. Okay, we've got another 5 minutes. Is there any other points, comments, questions, challenges? Feedback from James is going to be our answers are all too vague. We don't give enough detail.
No, I take that there's many ways of skinning a cat, and you don't have to do it one way or another. I think trying yourself, I think the big takeaway for me is try it and keep a good eye on your own results, learn from them. But recognizing that it's, you're not sure what the variable is that's changed, given that so much changes. As the videos that you showed demonstrate, you can have, a rainy night and suddenly with the same amount of time on the same strip does way more damage, and it's just one night. It's not even more time than, not leaving them an extra day by mistake. It's just particularly wet and you get sudden serious damage. It's windy, they all go to one end out of the wind and wreck that end of the field. And yeah, it's I'm quite happy with the how do you put it, playing around it, not being all neat and tidy, and ideally being as lazy as Silas if I can get away with it. It's just learning how lazy you can be without being, how do you put it, missing a trick or being irresponsible in terms of what you should be doing. But yeah.
Well, I think, and that comes back to look at the end product, look at the animals that are coming out of the system. And, there's a guy up near us in Scotland, a guy called Stuart Allen, who's a very savvy, switched on guy. And he always says that, we can go on farm walks and we can all stand there looking at the ground and we can have conversations about what different seed mixes we're going to use and what we're going to, how we're going to do this with our animals or that with our fields and all these different things. And he's like, if you just stand back and look at the animals that you've got and whether the output is kind of where you need it to be or where you want it to be, is there too much need to go messing around at the other ends? Because every impact you have will have cascading and compounding effects. And so, yeah, you start messing around with things, what impact is that going to have? And it's just being the ability to step back and look at the whole picture and then zooming into particular parts and then stepping out and looking again. And, if we start getting into the detail of how to be a good farmer in changing times under regenerative principles, it's not really about farming, it's about mindset and being able to be critical and analyze and accept that you're probably wrong, which is something that Alan Savory talks about all the time. Just whatever decision you make, accept you probably made the wrong decision, and then go back, review what you did and think about how you might do it differently next time, knowing that none of us can ever really reach perfection, apart from there'll be one beautiful morning where you're moving your animals and the sun will come out and everything will be beautiful, and you just have to live for those moments because the rest of the time we're all full of self-doubt about whether we did the right thing bale grazing or not. Gosh, it's got deep this evening, hasn't it? That's what happens when Silas and I get together. Cool. Are there any other questions or comments or anything else that any of you might want to comment on?
Can I just say one more thing? If nobody else wants
do.
I mean, you say the best indicator is the cows. We've got two in one group. We've got some nearly 3-year-olds, which are pregnant, looking really fat and good, and then the young, sort of 18 months ones are looking quite scrawny. So and haven't, they're not doing badly, but they're not putting on much weight. They're growing their frames still, I'd say. So
they're pregnant, the younger ones.
Sorry?
Are the younger ones pregnant?
No, they're not. But even your indicator is not always easy to read whether you're, giving them enough or not. They're just maybe teenager, growth spurt, scrawnier animals. It's quite hard to use that as an indicator. That's how, got to do it for a couple more years and I'll pick up. But particularly wet winter, and you just wonder, are they getting enough? They're not ever short of feed, but so they eat ad lib. They've got a bale or they've got grass or both. But yeah, maybe I'm going to have a session on learning what you're looking for in the cattle.
Yeah, for sure. And like you say, at the
Very
life
obvious.
stage they're at, and remembering that at this time of year, it's normal for animals to be shedding, you know, for them, if they've gone into the winter super fat and they're outside, it's very normal for them to be losing that off their backs. And particularly if they're still in kind of growing mode, then yeah, they also grow at kind of, you know, a bit of leg here and a bit of frame there and a bit of gut there. So it can be difficult, you know, they can look awful one day and you go back a week later and suddenly they've kind of balanced out a little bit. So you're right, it can be tricky. Tricky to determine whether what you're doing is the right thing. And I guess one thing that you could satisfy yourself with is that we really push our animals. We give them quite a hard time and they all have to carve it too. So they're probably looking much rougher than yours. So just think to yourself, they're probably looking better than Nikki's cattle at any given moment at this time of year as we go into the hungry gap.
Great, thank you. I do need, my other meeting is now started or about
Oh,
to
you
start.
need to head off. Well, thanks for joining us,
Thank
James.
you. Thank you very much.
I'll tell you what, we're going to put, we'll pull things to a close there. Thank you, Silas, so much for your insights. Always a joy to be joined by you on anything like this. So thanks for coming along after a busy day at Dairy Tech. Thanks everyone else for coming along and asking great questions and having some good conversations. So look forward to our final session next week, where we're going to be looking at dealing with extreme conditions. So yeah, look forward to that. Take care, folks.